Welcome to English Crime Files. Step into the archives as we uncover another gripping case from the dark side of history. The university professor and the demon of the jinn. The summer of 2002 descended on Khmissat like a furnace door swung wide open. Heat rippled off the asphalt in shimmering waves, and the air hung thick with dust and the cloying sweetness of overripe fruit from the roadside stalls. It was the kind of heat that shortened tempers and lengthened shadows, the kind that seemed to breed trouble. The criminal brigade in the northern city of Khmissat knew this rhythm well. Summer was always the busy season. More movement, more friction, more human heat sparking into violence. But even by those standards, the call that came through that afternoon was strange. A man was dead in Khmissat. That much was certain. But how he had died, that was a question wrapped inside a riddle, sealed behind the door of a small motel room on the edge of town. The Khmissat brigade received the summons with sparse, unsettling details. A body in the morgue, a local investigation already stalled, a request for the criminal unit to take over. No cause of death, no suspect, just a dead man, and a room full of questions no one could yet answer. The team gathered their equipment, exchanged grim, wordless nods, and climbed into the unmarked vehicle for the 2-hour drive south. The highway stretched ahead flat and featureless, the midday sun bleaching the landscape to a pale, exhausted yellow. They spoke little along the way. Seasoned investigators learn early to withhold speculation until they've seen the scene with their own eyes. But in the privacy of his own mind, each man was already turning over the sparse facts, trying to force them into something that made sense. None of them succeeded. The morgue in Khmissat was a squat, functional building on the edge of the hospital complex, the kind of place that wore its grim purpose without apology. The local commissaire led the team inside, his face betraying a deep, unsettled confusion he made no effort to hide. He walked them to the cold storage unit, pulled open the heavy steel door, and gestured toward the body laid out on the slab. "Here he is," he said, his voice low. "We haven't touched him beyond the initial examination. We wanted you to see him exactly as he was found." The dead man lay completely naked, his body unmarked by any obvious fatal wound. He rested on his back, one arm slightly bent, his head turned to the side. At first glance, he looked almost peaceful, a man in his late 40s or early 50s, his face composed, his limbs relaxed. But as the investigators circled the slab, the details began to surface. One entire side of his face, from temple to jawline, was a deep, mottled purple, a bruise so extensive and so dark it looked like a splash of wine frozen into the skin. A trace of dried foam, faint but unmistakable, clung to the corner of his mouth. His eyes, half open, stared at nothing at all. The lead investigator leaned closer. "What killed him?" The commissaire shrugged, a gesture of genuine helplessness. "That's the problem. We don't know. No stab wound, no gunshot. The bruise on his face, maybe he fell on it, but it didn't kill him. The foam, maybe poison, maybe a seizure. The autopsy is scheduled. We were waiting for you." "Where was he found?" Something flickered behind the commissaire's eyes. "That's where it gets strange. He wasn't found in his room. He was found in the street, naked. He came out through the window." The investigators exchanged glances. Out the window, the lead asked, "What floor?" "Third floor. The window is small. A ventilation window. Really, high up on the wall. You'll see it for yourselves." But somehow this man, this professor, a scholar of Islamic law, came through that opening and fell 3 stories into the street. And the people who saw him fall say he wasn't screaming. They say he came out like he was thrown. The word hung in the cold air of the morgue. Thrown? By whom? By what? The professor had been alone in that room. The door had been locked from the inside, and the room itself. The commissaire hesitated, searching for the right words. The room contained things none of the local officers could explain. "We need to see it," the lead investigator said. "Now." The motel stood on the outskirts of Khmissat, a 2-story building of faded yellow paint and rusted iron balconies. It was not the kind of place that catered to tourists. It was a motel in the truest, barest sense. A place for transient sleep, for truck drivers passing through, for travelers who needed a bed and nothing more. No restaurant, no cafe, just rooms, a narrow staircase, and a parking lot that turned to mud whenever it rained. The street outside was lined with small shops, a butcher, a spice cellar, a scattering of hardware stalls. A place of function, not comfort. The manager, a nervous man with a thin mustache and trembling hands, led the investigators up the stairs to room 17. He unlocked the door and stepped aside, refusing to enter. "We left everything," he whispered. "We didn't touch anything. We thought it was better you saw it as it was." The room was small, 10 square meters at most. A single bed with a worn coverlet, a small round table, 2 wooden chairs, a narrow wardrobe, a sink in the corner, its faucet dripping with a slow, rhythmic insistence. The air was stale, heavy with the lingering ghost of something burnt. Incense, perhaps, or something less benign. And on the table, arranged with a precision that spoke of ritual, sat the evidence that would haunt every man who entered that room for the rest of his career. A small clay bowl, half filled with what appeared to be human blood. A dish of saffron threads, their deep red tendrils stark against white ceramic. A reed pen and a horn inkwell filled with a thick, black substance that was not ink. 7 lamb cutlet bones, arranged in a deliberate star pattern atop a cloth marked with cryptic diagrams and esoteric symbols. And beside that cloth, small, pale, and utterly horrifying, lay the skeletal hand of a child. The bones yellowed with age, the fingers stained with saffron and ink, the joints worn smooth as though from years, perhaps decades, of handling. A small brazier sat on the floor near the table, its brass surface smudged with soot, holding the remains of burnt incense mingled with scraps of animal hide and fragments of dried herbs. The smell clung to everything, sweet, acrid, and deeply wrong. The window, the one the professor had allegedly come through, sat high on the wall, a small ventilation casement operated by a dangling chain. It was barely wide enough for a grown man's shoulders to pass through, and it opened onto a sheer 3-story drop. Below, the pavement still bore a dark patch the sun had not yet fully dried. The lead investigator stood at the center of that room, surrounded by the implements of an occult practice he could not name. and felt the cold creep of a truth that defied rational explanation. This was not a simple murder. This was not a crime of passion or greed. This was something reaching into the shadows at the very edge of human understanding, into the space where the world of men and the world of the jinn were said, by those who believe such things, to intersect. The professor had come to this room to perform a ritual. The ritual had gone wrong, and whatever force he had summoned had, according to the only witnesses, thrown him through a window too small for his body and left him broken on the street below. The question was no longer who had killed him. The question was what? The forensic team arrived within the hour, their white vans pulling into the motel's gravel lot as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. The heat had not broken, but a dry wind had risen, rattling the loose shutters and carrying the distant call of a muezzin drifting over the rooftops. The investigators cordoned off the entire third floor while the motel manager sat slumped in a plastic chair by the entrance, face buried in his hands. He had not expected his quiet establishment to become the center of a criminal investigation, and the shock was etched into every line of his body. Inside room 17, the forensic technicians moved with the slow, deliberate choreography of their profession. Every surface was dusted for prints, every object photographed from a dozen angles. The clay bowl of blood was sealed into an evidence bag, its dark contents still viscous in the heat. The dish of saffron, the reed pen, the horn inkwell, all of it was cataloged and removed, piece by piece, until the table stood bare. But it was the skeletal hand that drew the longest, most troubled stares. The medical examiner on scene, a pragmatic woman in her 50s who had seen her share of grim discoveries, held the small bones up to the light and confirmed what everyone in the room already feared. They were human. The hand of a child, likely between 6 and 8 years old, the bones worn smooth from extensive handling. The saffron and ink had bled deep into the porous surface, evidence, it seemed, of years, perhaps decades, of ritual use. How does a professor of Islamic law come to possess a child's skeletal hand? The lead investigator murmured, more to himself than to anyone listening. The window demanded their attention next. The ventilation casement measured 40 centimeters wide by 60 centimeters high, a narrow rectangle set high in the wall, nearly 2 meters off the floor. The chain that operated it swayed gently in the draft from the open door. The investigators measured and remeasured, running the physics of what the witnesses claimed again and again. A grown man, broad-shouldered, weighing at least 80 kilograms, had supposedly passed through this opening, not climbed through, but passed through with enough force to clear the frame and fall 3 stories to the street below. There was no damage to the window frame, no splinters, no bent metal, only the dangling chain and the dark stain on the pavement far below. The forensic team turned their attention to the street. The pavement beneath the window ran narrow, fronting a row of shops, a butcher, a spice merchant, a hardware vendor. The investigators canvassed the shopkeepers, and the accounts they gathered were remarkably, unsettlingly consistent. 2 men, the butcher and a customer waiting on his order, had been standing outside when it happened. They heard no scream, no cry for help, only a sudden, violent crash as the naked body of the professor struck the ground. The butcher described it as a sack of bones falling from the sky. He swore on his mother's name that he had seen the man emerge from the window, not as if he had jumped, but as if he had been propelled, limbs flailing, body arcing outward from the building with a force that defied explanation. The customer, a young man buying meat for his family's dinner, added a detail that made the investigators go still. He said that just before the body fell, he had heard a sound from the window, a low, guttural noise like a growl, or something closer to deep, resonant chanting. It was not a human scream, he insisted. It was something else entirely, something he could not name. Back inside the motel, the investigators began reconstructing the professor's final hours. The trail led first to the bus station. The professor had arrived in Khmissat on an inner-city bus from Agadir, where he had been visiting a religious scholar, a man his wife would later describe as a spiritual guide from the professor's youth. The bus driver remembered him clearly, a quiet passenger dressed in a simple gray jalaba, carrying a small leather satchel, who spoke to no one during the entire journey. But when the bus reached the outskirts of Khmissat, the professor had suddenly risen from his seat and walked to the front. "Stop here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let me off here." The driver had been confused. The bus had not yet reached the station. "Here? But there's nothing here, sir. Let me take you to the station." "No, here. Please, stop here." The driver shrugged, pulled the bus to the side of the road, and watched as the professor descended the steps and walked away into the dusty street without a backward glance. It was the last time anyone outside the motel would see him alive, and the driver's account painted the picture of a man with a purpose. A man who knew exactly where he was going and exactly what he meant to do once he got there. The investigators retraced the professor's path from the drop-off point toward the motel. Along the way, they stopped at the butcher shop they had already visited. The butcher, a burly man in a blood-stained apron, a gold tooth flashing when he spoke, filled in another piece of the puzzle. The professor had come into his shop that afternoon, still carrying his leather satchel, and had asked for 7 lamb cutlets, specific, almost obsessive, about how they were cut. From this side, the professor had instructed, pointing to a hanging carcass. "No salt. Please, I beg you, no salt at all. I have a heart condition. If the meat touches salt, I could die. Please, my brother, wash the knife first." The butcher, amused but accommodating, had obliged, washing his blade, cutting the 7 cutlets exactly as instructed, wrapping them in paper. The professor paid, thanked him profusely, and continued on his way. The investigators noted the mention of a heart condition and filed it away. The autopsy would either confirm it or render it meaningless. The professor's next stop was a spice shop 2 doors down. The shopkeeper, an old man with a henna-dyed beard and kind eyes, remembered him well. The man had purchased a small brass brazier, the kind used for burning incense, along with a package of high-quality frankincense. He had not haggled over price. He had simply paid, nodded his thanks, and left, his satchel now bulging with his strange acquisitions. From the spice shop, the investigators traced the professor's steps directly to the motel. The manager confirmed the check-in time, just after the afternoon prayer and described the professor's manner as calm, polite, entirely unremarkable. He had requested a room on an upper floor, away from the street noise. He had paid in cash for a single night, and then he had climbed the stairs to room 17, closed the door behind him, and locked it from the inside. No one saw him again until he fell from the sky. The investigators stood in the motel corridor, evidence bags lined up at their feet, and tried to force the disparate pieces into a coherent picture. A professor of Islamic law travels from Fez to Agadir to collect a blessing from an old spiritual master. On his return journey, he abruptly leaves the bus in Khmissat, a city where he has no known connections. He buys lamb cutlets with obsessive precision, a brass brazier, and frankincense. He checks into a cheap motel, locks himself inside a tiny room, and arranges a tableau of occult paraphernalia: human blood, a child's skeletal hand, a ritual diagram, incense, and cutlets laid out in a 7-pointed star. And then, somehow, he is propelled through a window too small for his own body and falls to his death, leaving behind a room that stinks of burnt offerings and a silence that feels heavier than any sound. The lead investigator pulled out his phone and dialed headquarters. His voice was clipped, professional, but beneath it ran a current of something he rarely allowed himself to feel: uncertainty. "We need to go to Fez," he said. "We need to talk to his wife. We need to know who this man really was. And we need to find the person, or the place, that taught him how to do this." He ended the call and looked back through the open door of room 17. The empty table, the dangling chain of the window, the faint, lingering smell of burnt incense, and something darker beneath it. For the first time in his 20-year career, he felt the distinct, unsettling sensation that he was not investigating a murder at all. He was investigating a summoning that had gone terribly, fatally wrong. The drive to Fez carried the investigators north through the rolling hills of the Cess Plain, the landscape shifting from the flat, sun-scorched earth of Khmissat to the greener, more cultivated land surrounding the ancient imperial city. They arrived in the late afternoon, the golden light of the descending sun painting the Medina's walls in shades of amber and rose. They navigated the narrow, winding streets until they reached a quiet residential neighborhood of modern villas on the city's outskirts, a world away from the crumbling motel where the professor had met his end. The house was a 2-story villa with a small garden, bougainvilleas spilling over its walls in cascades of magenta. A woman answered the door, dressed in a dark gray jalaba, her hair covered, her eyes rimmed red with recent tears. She was composed, dignified, the kind of woman who carried her grief silently rather than letting it spill into the world. Behind her, somewhere in the dim hallway, the faint sound of children's sobbing drifted through the house. Relatives had gathered, an aunt, perhaps a cousin, their hushed voices falling silent as the investigators introduced themselves. The widow led them into a traditional Moroccan salon, its long, cushioned benches lining the walls, the air heavy with the scent of rosewater and grief. She offered tea, her hands steady, her movements almost mechanical, and they accepted out of respect. Then, gently, the lead investigator began. "Madam, We're deeply sorry for your loss. Your husband was a respected man, a professor, a scholar. We need to understand what happened to him, and we believe you may hold the key." The widow nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the embroidered curtains. She spoke in a quiet, measured voice, as though reciting facts she had already turned over in her mind 1,000 times. "My husband was a man of faith," she said. "He taught Islamic law at the university. He was a good man, a devoted father. But beneath that, there was another side to him, a side few people ever knew." She explained that her husband, Dr. Ibrahim El-Hassani, had not always been a man of the city. He had grown up in a small village in the hills near Townate, a place of narrow dirt roads and ancient traditions. As a boy, he had been sent to a zawiya, a rural religious lodge, to study the Quran, Sharia, and the spiritual sciences. The zawiya was renowned across the region, a place where young men learned not only to recite the holy book, but to heal the sick, to drive out malevolent spirits, to navigate the invisible world most people never see. "My husband was a gifted student," the widow continued. "The sheikh of the zawiya saw potential in him. He taught him things that are not written in books. The knowledge of the letters, the science of the afak, the tables of correspondence between the seen and the unseen. But there is a line, Messrs. There is the path of the Rabbani, the path that heals, that protects. And there is the path of the Shaitani, the one that calls on darker forces, that seeks power for its own sake. My husband, he crossed that line." The investigators exchanged glances. The word Shaitani hung in the air like smoke. The widow continued, her voice trembling for the first time. "He had been traveling to the zawiya for years, even after we married. He would go to collect baraka, blessing, from the old sheikh. He took on tasks for people who came to him for help. Someone sick, someone afflicted with the evil eye, someone who believed they were possessed. He would recite the Quran over them, prepare remedies, drive out the spirits. This was the Rabbani path. But lately he had been going more often. He grew secretive. He would lock himself in his study at night, and I would hear him murmuring, chanting things I could not understand. When I asked, he would say it was nothing, that he was working on a difficult case. But I knew he was reaching for things he should never have touched." The lead investigator leaned forward. "Madam, did your husband ever bring objects into the house? Objects that seemed unusual?" The widow closed her eyes. "Once, I found a small wooden box in his study. Inside were bones, small bones like fingers, and a piece of old leather marked with writing, symbols I could not read. I confronted him, and he grew angry. He said it was for his work, that I should not ask questions. I was frightened, but I trusted him. I never imagined." She stopped, her composure finally cracking, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The investigators gave her a moment before asking the question that had brought them to Faze in the first place. "Do you know where this zawiya is? We need to speak with the sheikh." She nodded. "In the hills near Sidi Kasem, off the old road. They call it Zawiyat al-Nur. The sheikh is an old man now, but he's still there. He knew what my husband was becoming. He may be able to tell you what happened in that room." The road to Zawiyat al-Nur was a narrow, rutted track winding through groves of gnarled olive trees and past fields of golden wheat. The investigators' vehicle bumped and swayed for over an hour, the GPS signal flickering in and out, until at last they crested a low hill and saw the Zawiya nestled in the shallow valley below, a cluster of whitewashed buildings arranged around a central courtyard, a small minaret rising above the mosque at its heart. Goats grazed the hillside. A donkey stood tethered to a post. The air was clean and silent, broken only by the distant chant of Quranic recitation drifting from an open window. A young student met the investigators at the gate and led them through the courtyard to a shaded alcove, where the sheik sat cross-legged on a woven mat. He was a man of immense age, his beard white as snow, his eyes clouded by cataracts but still sharp with intelligence. He wore a simple white jalaba and a knitted skullcap, his gnarled, spotted hands resting on a worn copy of the Quran. He greeted the investigators with the quiet dignity of a man who had long since made peace with the world's deeper mysteries. They told him of the professor's death. They described the room in the motel, the blood, the bones, the diagrams, the window too small for a man to pass through. The sheik listened in silence, his expression unchanging. When they finished, he exhaled a long, sorrowful breath and began to speak. Dr. El-Hassani was a brilliant student, he said, one of the most gifted I have ever taught. He came to this Zawiya as a boy, and he learned the Quran with a speed that astonished his teachers. But more than that, he learned the hidden sciences, the ilm al-huruf, the knowledge of the letters, the afak, the magical squares, the invocation of the jinn. I taught him the path of the Rabbani, the path of healing, of protection, of driving out evil. But the line between the divine and the satanic is a thin one, and some who walk it are tempted by the promise of greater power. Dr. El-Hassani was one of those. He began exploring the darker texts. He sought out the tables that summoned the shayatin, the rebellious spirits. He believed he could control them. He was wrong. The sheik paused, his blind eyes turning toward the investigators as if he could see them more clearly than any sighted man. What he attempted in that motel room was a jadwal, a ritual of invocation. The lamb bones, the child's hand, the blood, the saffron, the incense. These are the instruments of summoning. He was calling upon a powerful entity, a shaitan of the lower order, to grant him something he desired. Knowledge, perhaps, or influence, or protection from an enemy. But he made a mistake. He drew one of the signs incorrectly. He mispronounced one of the sacred names. And when a mistake is made in such a ritual, the entity summoned does not simply leave. It turns on the one who called it. It punishes the arrogance of the attempt. And the window, the lead investigator asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How did he go through the window? The sheik shook his head slowly. That was not your professor. That was the shaitan leaving its vessel. When a spirit is forced out violently, it takes everything with it. The breath, the life, the body itself. It threw him through that window as a sign, a warning to others who would follow the same path. What you found in that room was not a crime scene, Messrs. It was a failed exorcism, one in which the spirit won and the exorcist paid the price. The investigators sat in stunned silence. The rational part of their minds, the part trained in evidence, forensics, the cold logic of criminal law, rebelled against the sheik's explanation. But another part, older and deeper, remembered the impossible dimensions of that window, the absence of a scream, the witnesses who swore the body had been propelled, not fallen, and the room itself, with its occult tableau, its stench of burnt offerings, its tiny skeletal hand handled for decades by someone who believed, without doubt, in its power. The sheik spoke once more before they left. I told you we teach the Rabbani path here, but there are always students who stray. They go into the cities, and they find clients willing to pay for darker work, love spells, revenge, curses. They call upon the shayatin, and for a while, the spirits serve them. But the spirits are not servants. They are predators, and when their summoner shows weakness, they strike. Your professor's file will go unsolved, because your law has no category for this. But you know the truth now, whether you accept it or not. That is between you and your God. Back at headquarters, the lead investigator submitted his final report. The death of Dr. Ibrahim El-Hassani was officially classified as undetermined. The forensic evidence pointed to a fall from a great height, but the mechanism of that fall could not be explained by any known physical means. The occult paraphernalia was cataloged and archived. The skeletal hand was sent for anthropological analysis. The remains of a child from the early 20th century, likely exhumed from an unmarked grave. The case closed not with resolution, but with a quiet, uneasy acceptance that some doors, once opened, can never fully be closed again. And as the veteran investigator filed the last of the paperwork, his mind drifted back to another night, years earlier, when he and his team had encountered something else that defied explanation in a very different way. A young woman, beautiful and barefoot, wandering a dark road near the equestrian grounds outside the city at 3 a.m. They had tried to bring her into the police vehicle, and she, a girl of perhaps 20, slender as a reed, had thrown 5 grown men aside as if they were children. She punched, kicked, and hurled them with a strength no human frame should possess. It took an ambulance crew and 2 additional officers to finally restrain her, and even then, she calmed only when her mother arrived and called her by name, the fight draining from her limbs all at once as she collapsed, weeping. The mother had explained, with the weary calm of long suffering, that her daughter was maskuna, possessed, and that she spoke in languages she had never learned, and broke chains that should have held a bull. The investigator had never forgotten that night, and now, sitting in his office with the professor's file closed on the desk before him, he understood that the world was larger and stranger than any police manual could ever account for. There were forces that moved in the shadows between what could be proven and what could only be feared. The professor had reached for one of those forces, and it had reached back. If you found this case compelling, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your theories in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next case.